what's the next big wedge issue? Because Republicans know, conservatives know, that they cannot win elections on economic issues. If they go out there, I mean, it used to be back in the 70s and the 80s, conservatives, well, even the 60s, arguably, conservatives could win elections from time to time by talking about tax cuts. But it's been, 34 years, 35 years since Ronnie Reagan did his massive tax cuts so badly that Reagan himself had to raise taxes to keep the country from sinking into, we had the worst stock market crash since the Great Depression on the Reagan's watch after his big tax cut. And so then he had to raise taxes to make up for it 18 times. But anyhow, what is it? It used to be that they could talk about tax cuts. In the 30 years, since Reagan did that, we've figured out that when Republicans talk about tax cuts, it's a scam. They're talking about tax cuts for rich people and throwing you and me a, $50 bone. So what are the wedge issues? For a long time, one of the wedge issues was guns, but Democrats haven't tried to restrict access to guns in the United States in, 20 years? There's been no consequential or serious effort. Obama's going to take your guns. I'm sorry, Obama hasn't proposed anything other than closing the gun show loophole and background checks, which are already, basically just tightening up the status quo. Well, they found one in Houston. And I expect to see this now being used by Republicans all across the country next year. I may be very, very wrong, but I suspect that next October, November, and December November when we're doing the post-election obituary or whatever. It's not an obituary. What is it when they study a corpse? Post-mortem. Thank you, Jim. When we're doing that we'll be sitting around going, oh yeah, that was it. The new wedge issue is don't let men into women's bathrooms. That was the bumper sticker. That was the slogan. That was the TV ad that they were using in Houston. Now, Houston and more than 200 other communities in the United States, including most of our major cities. So this is like low-hanging fruit and ripe picking for the right-wing spinmeisters. Houston and over 200 different communities across the United States have passed laws saying that you may not discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation. Now, what this means is, what these laws mean, is that if you're particularly vulnerable are transgender people. Now, gay people also, but one of the particular, arguably one of the most vulnerable portions of the LGBTQ community are people who are transgender. And so So what the original legislation did was it said you can't deny people housing. You can't refuse to rent to them. You can't refuse to loan money to them to buy a house. You can't refuse to serve them in restaurants. You can't refuse to hire them when they're qualified. You can't discriminate. And one very small, almost afterthought part of that was, any public facility. Well, any public facility includes bathrooms. Now, to say that somebody who was born as a man and is now living as a woman, sometimes they still have male equipment, sometimes not. Does it matter? Well, apparently it matters a lot to the people in Houston. And this and to probably not even just conservatives. This is the scare stuff. This is, reefer madness. It's going to make those black men crazy and they're going to rape your white women. Or gay marriage. It's going to, empower gays to God only knows what. Every one of these right-wing wedge attacks, has actually, it benefits the by making pot illegal. We'll get to Ohio in a few minutes. There's a bunch of elections here. I want to get to Kentucky as well. But I think that this Houston one is going to be huge because they figured out that in this public accommodations and anti-discrimination legislation, even though bathrooms aren't even spelled out in it, that argue, and much like, voter fraud, this is a classic example of the Republicans taking a non-issue. There is not an epidemic of women running, screaming out of women's bathrooms because there's a man in there. There has been no epidemic of that. There's no epidemic of creepy men going into, and I'm not talking about transgender people, I'm talking about creepy men going into, pedophiles or predators going into women's bathrooms to prey on young girls. None of it. Just like there's no epidemic of voter fraud. But the Republicans have succeeded in passing laws against the non-existent voter fraud in over 20 states. And they will use this too. Now, why? Because it gets Republicans to the polls. Now, why does that matter? Because they want to elect Republicans. Why do they want to elect Republicans? To make the fat cats richer. So they've got to find the wedge issues to get the rubes out. To get the people who are, oh my God, I'm a father, I've got a daughter. I don't want them I don't want men walking into the girls' room when they're, we can't, I can vote against that. When that's not really even the legislation. I mean, it's amazing. But I think that, this is just like the Kochs were using Wisconsin as a test site, and they learned some very good lessons from it. The right wing, probably the Kochs involved with it, have been using Houston as a test site.